just have to tell you, there's a lot of things that I love about the United States, and I love the fact that I was born here and have grown up in the United States. There's so many things I'm thankful for. One of the things I was thankful for when I got into grade school was how short our history is. We all... I mean, wasn't that good? I mean, think about it. You go into one of those countries that's got like thousands of years of history, and fifth grade must have been horrible because you were like, I got years of history and all that kind of stuff. Well, United States, it's like 200 years, and people are sitting around the classroom goes, Adams, well, you must be from John. I mean, because you could trace your histories and all that kind of stuff because it's so short. And when you say he's my great, 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 great grandfather, you can kind of go back and prove it. Well, not so much if your country's 2,000 years old. And so what happens is, in the United States, we get used to a short history where we can see that play out. But when we go to a country where there's a long history, oftentimes it just sort of eludes us and it's just too much. We just close the book and set it away. However, when we come to the book of Hebrews, it's really hard to do that. We have to kind of understand the context out of which all this stuff works. And so we have to understand the history. Now, by the time you get to Jesus, the Jewish people have been around for 2,000 years. If you date them from the time of Abraham, Abraham was kind of the founder. As you may remember, he left Iraq, where his original home was. He traveled around because he had been promised two things. He had been promised a land, and he had been promised a people, neither of which he owned. He was sort of a Bedouin kind of guy. He was traveling along, but God had promised them, and he trusted God and followed God on that promise. And so he travels around to the promised land, and he has a son, and he actually has two sons, and that becomes a people that we follow through the Jewish faith. Now, that's the beginning, but that's 2,000 years before Jesus. So if we had to go through all that history, we would be here forever. But let me just give you a couple biggies, okay? This will be the short course in Jewish history. Abraham was kind of the family that started it, but after that, the family began to coalesce around the promised land until the time when a famine came and they ended up moving through a series of events to Egypt. Good so far? All right, so we've just covered about, 300, 400, 500 years of history, more than the United States combined, but you get it, okay? So Abraham, and then you end up in Egypt, and they were there for 400 years, and by the time they were done with that 400 years, they were in slavery. We're about 700 years into history now, about 700 years, but a guy comes up, his name is Moses, and he says, let my people go. You guys tracking with this? You remember it? Go back and watch King of Egypt. You'll kind of get it. It's a Disney film. You'll want to watch it over holidays. That'd be great. Moses said, let my people go. They all go out. Remember, they go out into the desert and follow around, and then Joshua takes them into the promised land. Now, here we are, 800 years after Abraham was given the promise, and now he has the promise fulfilled. 700 or 800 years later. Does that bug you at all? I mean, you go to God in prayer and you say, Lord, you have promised this by your word. Now see it fulfilled. And oftentimes there's a lag time between when we pray and when things are fulfilled. And that lag time really ticks us off because we want God to move. We want to, kind of second day, 2-day service, sort of thing like that. But you see in history a long period of time here, but God's promise is sure, and there they find themselves in the promised land. Now again, we're about 1,200 years before Jesus already, and they have to figure out how to govern themselves. And so what they do is they go through a series of judges and later kings in order to govern themselves. But the best way they know to do it is they take the 12 tribes of Israel and they divide them and each give them land. Now you understand the whole of Jewish history, because up until that point, it is just the creation of this land. Now it's the living out of it. So the next 1,200 years, they have to live out of these small configurations of tribal land in the nation of Israel. Here's the thing you need to know before we go to Hebrews. One of these tribes were set aside and not given any land. They were given a job instead. And their job was to serve in the temple. Their names were the Levites, okay? And the Levites were simply to serve in the temple. Now, before it became a temple with rock sides, it was really a tent, and they would go in the tent, and that was their worship space. It was a lot like this space in terms of size. It was a place where everybody gathered, and the priest would take the offerings of the people, and he would make it a sacrifice before God. And that was the Levites' job, and they were called the priestly tribe. Okay? Now, all that background is there, 2,000 years of history, because when the writer of Hebrews wants to describe Jesus, he wants to describe him in terms of being a priest. And everybody who's Jewish would have gone, I got that, right? But you all don't get that because you don't live with that every day. But every day they would walk in and they would sacrifice and let the priest do it for them. He was kind of a go-between. Okay? He was a go-between between the people and God. And that go-between is important. Now let's turn to the scripture. I want you to see it. As we read it, you can understand a little bit of what the writer is talking about. It says this, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we possess." See, in a small little comment there, you wouldn't have gotten it, but everybody gets it. Now, the priest is no longer the priestly tribe, it's Jesus. Remember, we talked over the last 3 weeks of how God sent his son, and he pitched a tent, and he became one of us. And the Hebrew people want to understand what it means that God came down. And at Christmas, that's what we talk about all the time. We talk about the baby being born and how God was there. And Emmanuel just simply means God with us. And he wants to say that was the great high priest who has come. The great high priest. And he overcomes all the other priestly tribe. And so let us hold fast to the faith we possess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness. You see, what God did when he broke into time and space is he became one of us. And God knows what it means to be cold. And he knows what it means to be hot. He knows what it is to be sad and what it is to be joyful. Here's a God who comes and is a part of that. I remember we had a kid in our youth group years ago, and we had a new guy come in and was helping us with the youth program, and he became fast friends with him. And I said to Mike, Mike, what do you love so much about John? And Mike said, you know what I love about him? He gets me. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, he was like me in school. He was in the band. His parents got divorced when he was 14. And when we talk about things, I don't have to explain myself because he gets me. You see, he understands me. And he knows me. And that's what he wants to tell us about Jesus here. Here's a God who broke into time and space, did not simply choose to stand outside of the material world and yell in rules to us, but he broke in. And see, it made all the difference when that was there, because it says he can empathize with our weakness. Do you all remember the movie Forrest Gump? There is a great scene in Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump, as you know, he had all these encounters with different people, but at the very beginning of the movie, they show him as a little kid, and he has braces on his legs. You remember that? Run, Forrest, run. And he had braces on his legs because he had a back problem, and they thought he was going to be crippled for life, right? And you see him walking in these braces everywhere he goes. Now, later on in the movie, when he becomes an adult, he saves his commanding officer in Vietnam. But the commanding officer loses his legs. And there in the hospital room, the commanding officer is so mad at Forrest Gump because he didn't let him die. And there's this wonderful scene where he pulls Forrest off his bed, throws him on the ground, and he said, "That's not the way it was supposed to be. I should have died." And he looks at Forrest and he holds him down and he said, "Do you have any idea what it's like to have legs that don't work?" You know, Forrest says, "I do, Lieutenant Dan." Right? It's a wonderful scene. And right in the middle of that scene, we get a vision of the gospel. Of here is a God who comes in and breaks into our world. And we go to him in prayer and we approach him and say, Lord, my life is broken. I'm hurting in this area. I'm joyful in this area. Do you understand? And the answer is yes. Yes. And it makes all the difference that he's broken into time and space. And we see that there. We have a great high priest who understands us, who is a go-between. It says this, we have a great high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet he did not sin. Speaking of Jesus, he was tempted in every way, but did not sin. Now, when we look at temptation, it's not something we talk about a great deal. 1 John talks about it. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, it says this. There's three biggies in temptation. They were the temptations that happened to Jesus as well. This is biblical language. I'm going to unpack it for you a little bit. Here are the three big temptations. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. I wish I could say that like a Baptist minister because you'd really be moved by that and everything. But I'm not that good at it, okay? So the lust of the eyes, that is when we begin to covet all sorts of things. And that's one of those things we really wrestle with at Christmas. I remember back in Laguna Beach, when I was pastor there, we had our first Christmas in Laguna Beach, and it was a large group of 20, 30-somethings. Now, in order to live in Laguna Beach, if you're 20, 30-something, you got to have some cash, okay? Because the homes there back in the 80s were in the millions, right? And so everybody there had a lot of money. And so we were going to go to this thing, and it was a white elephant gift. You brought it, it's $10 a piece, right? Okay? So we get there, and everybody's bringing these gifts, and we're opening them, and here's the deal. You can steal the other person's gift. We still do this at our staff party, by the way. It's live entertainment. But we're there, and you can steal somebody's gift. And so what happens is that you get in there, and people begin to be very attached to their gift very quickly. And we had one gal who opened it, and it was sort of a white elephant gift, but it was hand-painted ornaments that were just kind of cool. You know, when you live in Laguna Beach, it's an artist community, and so this person in our group just sort of hand-painted these ornaments, but they turned out to be really cool, right? So immediately the gal sort of latched onto them, right? And she latched onto them. It was not 2 people later where another gal came and took them from her, smiling. That started a feud that lasted for a full year. Isn't that amazing? I mean, I kept looking at it because you could watch the two of them throughout the evening get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. And they literally didn't speak for the next year. Because what happens is we get fixated on something and we lose sight of what's important, right? The relationship's important, but because we get fixated on it, we lose sight of it. And what happens in that situation was that she fixated on those things. Now, here's the deal. Her husband could go commission that gal to paint ornaments for the rest of her life, right? There was money there. This was $10. And yet there was something about it. It's like Gollum who wants that ring and will give up everything, right? And it says the lust of the eyes, that temptation is there. And what the temptation is not just whether it's good or bad. The temptation is to put our lives into something that's of lesser value. Do you hear that? It's to give ourselves to something that's of lesser value instead of to the God who loves you. And Jesus was tempted like that in the desert. He said, you can have this bread, you can have the world, you can have all these things. And Jesus resisted that temptation. Because every time we go into that temptation, what happens is we lose sight and we begin to push people out and we lose our very selves. And God knows that because God created us. These temptations are important for us to understand, but Jesus was tempted in that way. It's not only the lust of the eyes, it's also the lust of the flesh. Now, normally we think about sex and whether sexual, all the kind of things, and we realize that sex used within its proper boundaries is a gift for God, right? But it's not just that. It's anything for which we begin to be owned, right? Could be an addiction of some kind. Could be overeating. Could be anything, right? It's when anything owns us outside ourselves. It says Jesus was tempted to do that even, right? But he did not sin. It's not only the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes, but it also says the pride of life. The pride that says, when I get things, I am better than you. And part of what happens at Christmas time around our trees with our families is we begin to compare. Begin to compare. A long time ago, because my kids aren't in the service, I'll tell you this. A long time ago, we realized wasn't matter what was in the box, but we better have the same number of boxes under the tree, right? I mean, that was a rule that was embedded in us because we're parents. And we realized we don't want to go through another Christmas like this when it was not like that, right? And so we began to count the boxes, and some Christmas mornings we were scrambling to wrap something of little value, but simply to put a box in there, right? Well, see, that's what happens here. And what happens is we begin to get control. And if you can remember this, the whole idea of temptation is the temptation to set our sights on something of lesser value than that which what God was have. And he says this, Jesus was that. Now, C.S. Lewis wrestled with this a lot. And he wrestled with this whole idea of temptation. In fact, he said, the question he kept asking him, if Jesus never sinned, then he doesn't know what temptation's like. He lived a sheltered life. Of course Jesus never sinned. He's out of touch with how strong temptation could be. But this is the answer that he gave there, because it's a valid question for us. He said this, a silly idea is current that good people do not know what temptation means. This is an obvious lie. For only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. Only those who try and resist it know how strong it is. After all, you find out the strength of the German army by fighting against it, not by giving in. You find out the strength of a wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. A man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like an hour later. That's why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They've lived a sheltered life by always giving in. Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is also the only man who knows to the full what temptation means. You see, Jesus was there, and he empathizes with us. He has faced the same things you face and that I face. And so then he finishes this with the implications. He says this, let us then approach God's grace, God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in a time of need. Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence. This Christmas, we have the opportunity to worship the Christ child tomorrow night. But we do so not because it's a baby in all its innocence, but because there is one who knows us, inside and out, who knows the ups and downs of life, who knows the temptations of life, who knows what it's like to be tempted to settle for something far less than what God has for you and for me. And when we come to worship tomorrow night, when we raise our candles high, it is because of the marvelous good news of a God who broke into time and space and pitched his tent among us, who walks with us and understands us. He gets us. And now he says, you can approach this throne of grace with boldness. Why? There's no more high priest as a go-between. Jesus is it. There's nobody we have to walk through. You don't have to walk through a pastor to get to God, because God is available and knowable and understandable to you and me because of what God has done in Jesus Christ. This Christmas, as we worship one who knows you intimately and who has said, "Come, for the doors are open to my grace."